Robb Stark stood in the cavernous high hall of the Eyrie, the wind keening through the moon door behind him, rattling old tapestries and echoing off the cold stone walls. From that lofty perch, one could survey the entire Vale. Its steep mountain paths, the stark crags, the green valleys below cradling sparkling rivers. This had ever been a stronghold of House Arryn, almost impossibly defended by the treacherous climbs and sheer drops that surrounded it. Yet, in that moment, it was not Lady Lysa Arryn on the high seat, nor any Arryn at all. Robb Stark, king in the north, stood as the focal point of the gathered lords. Yohn Royce, Nestor Royce, Anya Waynwood, and others whose ancestral sigils flanked the white falcon and crescent moon of House Arryn. He had come to secure their help, to plead a case that had grown more urgent with every passing day. His father, Lord Eddard Stark, lay murdered by order of the so-called King Joffrey Baratheon, Lannister in truth. War had erupted across the Seven Kingdoms. The North had proclaimed Robb their king, the Riverlands stood with him, and now, in the Vale, he meant to forge a new alliance. The Eyrie, always a place of quiet rumor and whispered secrets, now thrummed with the tense energy of men deciding the fate of kingdoms. Lady Lysa, pale and trembling, had wanted to remain aloof, claiming the safety of her son was paramount. She was overruled not by force, but by the ancient ties that once united the North and the Vale under Jon Arryn and Eddard Stark. With every passing hour, the voices of the Vale lords rose in support of Robb's plea for justice. Yohn Royce, massive in stature and commanding in his presence, made a speech that called upon old debts and older friendships. One by one, the Vale lords knelt, pressing their fists to their hearts. Even Lysa, lips pressed thin, gave silent assent. The promise was made that, for the first time in years, the Knights of the Vale would leave the security of their mountain homes and ride in open war. At dawn the next day, the Vale banners, pristine, proud white falcons on fields of blue, were unfurled beside the gray direwolf of House Stark. Robb stood at the head of this new alliance, hair ruffled by the stiff wind as he gazed over the assembled knights. They were impressive in their steel plate and polished helms, lances upright, their destriers stamping the flagstones. The faint ring of steel carried on the breeze, accompanied by the soft whickering of horses. Such might, hidden behind the sentinel peaks of the mountains of the moon, had never before ridden forth in a unified host in living memory. A hush descended as Robb raised his gloved hand. The mountains themselves seemed to listen. "We ride for justice," he said, voice carrying clear in the morning air. "We ride for my father, Eddard Stark, and for Jon Arryn, whose memory you hold dear. We ride for the peace and freedom of the Vale, the Riverlands, and the North. And together, we will show the Lannisters and their false king that honor yet lives in the Seven Kingdoms." A roar went up from the knights, a wall of sound that reverberated across the Eyries yard and soared into the thin, crisp air. With that, the war horns bellowed, the gates swung wide, and the Knights of the Vale began their long descent from the heights that had sheltered them for so long. Their destination, the Riverlands first, and beyond that, wherever the Lannisters bared their claws. Days of travel followed, winding down narrow switchback roads carved into the sides of mountains, past the gates of the moon, through the high passes and into the more navigable terrain below. Robb's northern bannermen met them along the way, forming a host so large that rumors of its size preceded them. Villages in the foothills watched in awe as thousands of knights, men-at-arms, and archers rode under the twin banners of the direwolf and the falcon. Where the mountains gave way to rolling hills, the combined force set up its first major camp. Tents spread across a wide meadow, bedrolls unrolled, and fires sprang to life as men began to fraternize. Northmen, grim in boiled leather and ringmail, found themselves sharing cups of ale with Vale knights sporting meticulously crafted half-plate. War stories broke the ice, told in quiet voices around the flames. Now and then, a hush would fall as talk drifted to the might of the Lannisters and their famed gold reserves, how they could muster mercenaries from across the narrow sea if they wished. But Yohn Royce, drinking horn in hand, reminded them in a deep baritone that gold would not shield the Lannisters if the Vale Knights smashed through their ranks. And the men from Winterfell, White Harbor, and the Dreadfort nodded grimly, for they too knew that Tywin Lannister's cunning had its limits. They had captured his son, Ser Jaime, once already, and they knew well that the lion could bleed. Robb traveled among the men often, accompanied by his direwolf, Grey Wind, whose silent presence commanded as much respect as any living commander. Where the great Jon boisterously told tales of his own feats, and Roose Bolton stood silent and watchful, Robb listened to the everyday concerns of archers, pikemen, squires. He reminded them that they fought not merely for vengeance, but for a vision of a freer north, and for the Vale, which had lived too long under Lady Lysa's fearful isolation while the realm burned. The king in the north was king to them all now, and in many eyes they saw a promise kept, the Vale and the north standing side by side. When the host finally emerged onto the familiar crossroads near the Trident, word reached them that Lannister foragers had been spotted pillaging local farms. These small bands had grown used to terrorizing peasants and scuttling away before any real challenge appeared. But they had never faced the Knights of the Vale. Under Lord Nestor Royce's command, 100 mounted knights descended upon one such foraging party, scattering the Lannisters in moments. The survivors, few as they were, spoke later of knights who seemed to descend from the heavens themselves, shining in polished steel, unstoppable with lances lowered and warhorses crushing the ground beneath iron-shod hooves. In Riverrun, Catelyn Stark watched the sun glint off the armor of the Vale host as they arrived, crossing the moat and assembling in the outer bailey. Edmure Tully, newly freed from the constant harassment of Lannister patrols, could scarcely hide his relief. The Riverlands, battered by war, had new cause for hope. Robb dismounted and embraced his mother, who clutched at him with both fear and pride in her eyes. The presence of so many Vale banners startled her, for she had worried that Lysa would never consent to risk the Vale's knights. Yet here they were, a testament to the bonds once forged under Jon Arryn's guidance. War councils followed. In Riverrun's great hall, tapestries depicting House Tully's trout shimmered in the firelight. Robb, Edmure, the great Jon, Roose Bolton, Yohn Royce, and other lords of note, both Northern and Vale, gathered around a massive oaken table. The conversation turned to Tywin Lannister's movements. Rumor placed him at Harrenhal, assembling a fresh host, while another contingent of Lannister forces still roamed the Riverlands. With the Knights of the Vale at his side, Robb proposed a bold plan. Clear the Lannisters from the Trident first, liberate the smaller castles that had bent the knee under duress, and consolidate their hold on the region. Then, with the Riverlands firmly in hand, they would confront Tywin's main host head-on. Yohn Royce ran a gauntlet hand over the runic embossments on his breastplate, listening intently. His face, set like chiseled stone, revealed neither excitement nor fear, only a calm acceptance that war was upon them, and they must press their advantage. When Robb finished outlining his strategy, the Lord of Runestone inclined his head in approval. They would move as one, the northern foot to secure the towns, the Vale Knights to deal hammer blows to any Lannister cavalry that dared approach. A wave of agreement passed around the table, sealed by shared cups of wine. Catelyn watched her son, proud of how he had grown into this role. A king indeed, tested by battle and by grief, but not shattered by either. Even so, she could not escape the pang of fear for Sansa and Arya. Sansa was a hostage in King's Landing, Arya missing. Each victory, no matter how grand, felt incomplete so long as her daughters remained lost. Still, she understood that to bargain effectively for their return, to truly break the Lannister hold, they must make themselves too strong to deny. The Knights of the Vale were a part of that strength, and so she prayed every night that nothing would tear this alliance apart. Tywin Lannister, in the haunted halls of Harrenhal, soon learned of the Vale's entry into the war. Ravens bearing dire news flapped into the fortress rookery day after day. The Vale Knights had crushed a foraging band here, a scouting party there. The north was unstoppable. Tywin's lines of supply were cut, and the Riverlands soared with fresh hope. Perhaps in another world, Tywin might have found a sly advantage, but the combined might of two great regions could not be ignored or dismissed. He fumed in his solar, scanning reports with a hawk's gaze. His mouth drew thin as he considered the new reality. The boy he had once dismissed as inexperienced had proven himself a formidable commander. Even the capture of Jaime, Tywin's favored son, had not taught him enough caution, it seemed. Now he faced an alliance far more potent than any other in the war. He issued new orders to bolster Harrenhal's defenses, demanded that outriders watch the roads for any sign of the Vale's cavalry, and sent desperate pleas to King's Landing for reinforcements. The realm was fracturing, though, and Tywin knew better than anyone that an appeal to a boy king and his manipulative mother might not come swiftly enough to save him. By late autumn, the combined army of the North and the Vale surged through the Riverlands, liberating or laying siege to any stronghold that still flew the Lannister lion. In some places, the lion banners came down without a fight, the garrison surrendering at the mere sight of Robb's forces. Local lords who had grudgingly bent the knee to the Lannisters found a renewed courage upon hearing the thunder of Vale warhorses galloping across their fields. With every victory, the bond between the Northmen and the Vale Knights grew stronger. They broke bread together, celebrating with cups of mead or wine in the courtyards of recaptured keeps. A mutual respect began to replace any old suspicions. Northern men, stoic and battle-hardened, discovered in the Vale Knights a reflection of their own sense of duty and honor. The Vale men, for their part, learned that the North's gruffness concealed a fierce loyalty and unwavering resolve. When lords from both regions gathered, they found shared jokes and stories of old hunts, feasts, and ancestors. The time soon came for an engagement that would test this alliance in a decisive battle. Tywin Lannister had consolidated what remained of his scattered forces and was marching from Harrenhal, hoping to catch Robb's army in a precarious position before they could fully unite near the Red Fork. Scouts brought the news to Riverrun, where Robb and Lord Yohn Royce convened the war council yet again. The proposed plan: Robb's northern infantry and cavalry would lure Tywin into battle on ground chosen by Robb, while the Vale Knights lay hidden behind a ridge. Once Tywin committed his main host, the Knights would sweep in from the flank, crushing the Lannister lines in a brutal pincer. The night before the battle, the camps were uneasy. Fires flickered like orange will-o'-the-wisps across the fields, and the hush of disciplined men waiting for war hung heavy in the air. Catelyn Stark visited her son's tent, watching as he calmly discussed final details with his lords. When he saw her, his demeanor softened briefly. He was, after all, still her child, though a crown rested on his head and a sword hung at his hip. She took his hand, telling him to remember that winning battles was not the same as winning the war, and that, above all, he must live to see his sisters freed. Robb nodded solemnly. They both understood that once the lines collided, fate spun on the tip of a spear. At dawn's light, the opposing armies formed up across a broad plain near the Red Fork, patches of ground still slick with dew. A thin morning mist clung to low hollows, swirling around the legs of restless horses. The Lannister banners, red and gold, rippled in a chill breeze. Robb's men readied themselves, the howling wolf of Stark and the soaring falcon of Arryn snapping overhead. The Vale Knights, hidden behind a gently rising slope, kept their mounts quiet, waiting for the signal. Robb rode down the northern line, pausing to clasp a shoulder here, offer a word of encouragement there. Gray wind padded at his side, ears pricked for any sign of alarm. Satisfied that the men were ready, Robb raised his sword, the morning sun flashing off Valyrian steel. Horns blared, deep and resonant, rolling across the field. The battle began with an exchange of arrows, northern archers loosing flights of shafts, Lannister crossbowmen returning fire. Men shouted curses, steel points found flesh, horses whinnied in panic. Then came the cavalry charges. Roose Bolton's men clashed with Lannister horse midfield. The sound of colliding armor, splintering lances, and screaming horses filled the air. Pockets of men fought desperately among the carnage, hacking and thrusting in red ruin. Meanwhile, the northern infantry advanced behind leveled spears, meeting Tywin's foot soldiers in a crunch of shields and steel. Step by bloody step, the lines ground into each other. Robb Stark hovered near the center, his banner by his side, waiting for the moment. Tywin Lannister had committed his reserves early, or so it seemed, to try to break the northern line swiftly. The ground rumbled from the press of thousands of men. Through the haze of dust and blood, Robb raised a horn to his lips and blew 3 long, echoing notes. A thunderous roar erupted from behind the ridge. Hooves tore at the earth as the knights of the Vale surged into view, lances bright in the rising sun, armor reflecting golden beams that cut through the morning gloom. Like an avalanche of steel, they descended on Tywin's flank, smashing aside defenders who scarcely had time to shout before being ridden down. The line of charging knights crashed into the Lannister ranks with irresistible force, punching through armor, scattering footmen, and cleaving a path of devastation. Caught between the unyielding northern line and the sudden hammer blow of the Vale charge, Tywin's men lost cohesion. Surrounded, hammered from both sides, they faltered. Some tried to flee, only to be cut down by pursuing cavalry or northern outriders. The battlefield became a swirling melee of blood-stained mud, severed banners, and broken lances. Many Lannister soldiers threw down weapons and cried for quarter. Amidst the horror, Robb pushed forward, gray wind snapping at the throats of any who dared challenge his king. He glimpsed Tywin Lannister himself, armored in gold plate, glaring across the chaos with hatred and desperation. But Tywin saw the trap too late, and the battered remnants of his troops fell back in an unorganized retreat. Robb's bannermen gave chase until he called them to halt, unwilling to risk scattering his forces into separate, vulnerable groups. The field belonged to him, and the Lannister defeat was total. Bodies littered the ground, and the groans of the dying mixed with the cheers of the living. When at last the sun climbed high, the smell of death weighed on the air like a blanket. Soldiers from both sides tended their wounded, and captives were corralled under guard. Robb surveyed the field with a heavy heart, though victory was theirs. Yohn Royce dismounted nearby, a fresh cut across his cheek, but triumph burning in his eyes. "Young wolf," he said in a voice still ringing with the adrenaline of battle. "Today, we have done what many thought impossible. Your father and my friend Jon Arryn would be proud." Robb nodded, swallowing thickly. "It was a joint victory," he said. "The Vale carried the day with that charge. My men would have fought to the last, but we needed your knights to break them." Behind them, Great Jon Umber was whooping triumphantly, calling for ale to toast their fallen enemies. Roose Bolton, in quieter satisfaction, roamed the battlefield, ensuring no threat remained. And beyond, men from the north and Vale alike clasped one another on shoulders, praising each other's bravery. The victory opened the path to Harrenhal, where, as the Ravens said, Tywin Lannister had reassembled a new force. Though Tywin had lost heavily this day, he was not yet defeated. Harrenhal was a fortress vast and fearsome, its melted towers a testament to ancient dragonfire. If Robb meant to eradicate Lannister influence in the Riverlands for good, he would have to break Harrenhal or force Tywin to abandon it. They pressed on, hearts buoyed by success but weighted by the knowledge that Tywin Lannister was at his most dangerous when cornered. The closer they drew to Harrenhal, the more haunting the landscape became. The once fertile fields of the Riverlands had been laid waste by raids and scorched earth tactics. Blackened ruins dotted the roadsides, and haggard small folk looked on with hollow eyes as the host passed. Despite the gloom, morale in Robb's army remained high. Each day brought fresh confirmations that the Lannisters were in retreat. Scout reports indicated that Tywin was digging in behind Harrenhal's walls. Inside that cursed fortress, he frantically sought a way to fend off what now appeared to be an unstoppable alliance. And unstoppable it might well have been. Northern archers in disciplined ranks, foot soldiers eager to finish the war, and the Vale Knights whose heavy cavalry charges could decide almost any battlefield. This was no makeshift rebellion. It was an army that had proven itself in the field, forging unity through blood and victory. Arriving at the outskirts of Harrenhal, they saw its looming silhouettes rising against an overcast sky. The fortress, built by the legendary King Harren the Black, was so massive it seemed like a city in itself, its walls rumored to be the tallest in the realm. Parts of it lay in ruin, melted by the fires of Aegon's dragons centuries past, yet it was still formidable. Tywin had barred the gates, placing archers on the ramparts. Smoke from numerous fires curled into the gray sky, betraying the presence of a substantial garrison within. A siege was unavoidable if Tywin refused to face them in open field. Around the battered remains of smaller outbuildings, Robb's host set up its own formidable camp. Trenches and palisades rose in a matter of days, forming a ring of steel and wood around Harrenhal's perimeter. Tywin's scouts tried to slip out by night, only to be captured by vigilant Vale sentries. Once that ring closed tight, ravens soared from Harrenhal's rookery, carrying Tywin's desperate pleas for aid. But from whom? King's Landing itself seethed under Joffrey's erratic cruelty. Cersei Lannister, bereft of Tywin's counsel, was rumored to be losing her grip on the court. The Tyrells eyed the Iron Throne with suspicion, and Renly Baratheon was dead, his camp scattered. Stannis Baratheon gathered forces in the south. Greyjoy longships raided the northern coasts. The realm fractured like ice under a blacksmith's hammer, and few seemed able or willing to come to Ty. Robb and his commanders debated the best way to assault Harrenhal's mighty walls. A direct storming could cost thousands of lives, but the fortress had weaknesses: collapsed sections, hidden postern gates, labyrinthine corridors. Lord Yohn Royce spoke of using a distraction while a hand-picked force scaled a damaged tower. Roose Bolton suggested a long siege to starve them out. The Great John called for rams and towers to bash down the gates in a glorious charge. Robb, keeping a level head, selected a blend of cunning and brute force. Partial siege lines to deny the fortress relief, combined with a covert infiltration through a weak point in the walls. On a cold, moonless night, a small group of northern rangers and Vale knights slipped through the darkness to an old servant's entrance near the water's edge. Silently, they overpowered the guards, pried open the rusted gate, and crept into Harrenhal's silent courtyards. The fortress seemed half-deserted in places, but Tywin's men were thickest around the main gates. Guided by map sketches gleaned from old accounts, the infiltrators located the mechanism controlling a secondary portcullis. After a swift, desperate fight, they killed the guards and heaved the ancient chains, opening a path for the Vale knights waiting outside. At the agreed signal, a single horn blast, those knights stormed in. Hooves rang against cobblestones, the flash of steel lances glinting in the torchlight. Shouts of alarm shattered the stillness. Tywin's men scrambled from their barracks, clashing with the intruders in narrow courtyards and winding corridors. Like water bursting through a weakened dam, more and more of Robb's forces poured into Harrenhal, overwhelming pockets of resistance. Siege towers, left unneeded outside, stood as silent witnesses to the cleverness of the plan. Tywin attempted a desperate breakout with his cavalry, only to be turned back by a line of pikes. The old lion fought with savage tenacity, cutting down men who challenged him. But he found himself cornered in one of Harrenhal's smaller courtyards, trapped by a pincer of northern foot and Vale horse. There, Robb Stark confronted him at last. Tywin's warhorse reared in terror at the sight of Grey Wind, and in the confusion, the Lannister lord was thrown. A hush fell as Tywin, dented helm askew, looked up at the young wolf. Firelight danced across Robb's armor, and Grey Wind snarled, lips pulled back to reveal terrible fangs. Blades of the Vale and the North surrounded the Lannister patriarch on all sides. Pride warred with self-preservation in Tywin's eyes. He had orchestrated so many atrocities, outmaneuvered countless foes, yet now knelt in the dust of Harrenhal. When Robb demanded his yield, Tywin dropped his sword. The clang of steel echoed like a final knell for Lannister supremacy in the Riverlands. Within hours, the entire fortress capitulated. Robb's banners flew from the ramparts, and Tywin Lannister, perhaps the most feared lord in Westeros, was thrown into chains. Cheers erupted from the courtyard to the walls as the men realized the magnitude of this victory. There, in the cursed halls once raised by Harren the Black, the unthinkable had happened. The lion had been caged, and the wolf and falcon stood in triumph. News of Tywin's capture spread through the realm at a gallop. In King's Landing, Cersei's face reportedly paled to parchment white upon hearing that her father was a prisoner. Joffrey's tantrums doubled in their cruelty, but fear crackled in the red keep like a drawn bowstring. Whispers of revolt stirred the small folk. If Tywin himself could fall, what hope did the boy king have against the might of the young wolf and his newly allied Vale knights? In the Westerlands, lords scurried to secure their holds, uncertain whether Robb would march west next. The north rejoiced, though its coasts suffered raids by the Ironborn. The Vale reveled in the knowledge that their knights had played a decisive role, elevating their prestige across all 7 kingdoms. Even the distant watchers in Essos, exiled lords and mercenaries, heard that a new power dynamic was reshaping Westeros. Within Harrenhal's great hall, Robb sat in what once served as the seat of Harren the Black. Tywin stood before him, wrists bound, head unbowed. Lords of the North and Vale filled the cavernous space, their breath steaming in the chill air. Outside, autumn winds howled around the melted towers. Torches sputtered, casting wavering shadows across the cracked stone floor. Catelyn Stark, Yohn Royce, the Great John, Roose Bolton, Edmure Tully, and many others looked on with rapt attention. Robb's voice carried with quiet authority. Tywin Lannister, you stand accused of waging unjust war, of murdering my father, and countless other crimes against the Riverlands and the North. He paused, letting each word sink in. In the name of House Stark and House Arryn, do you deny these charges? Tywin's lips thinned. I did what was necessary to safeguard my house and my legacy. A murmur of fury spread through the hall, but Robb stilled it with a raised hand. You are my prisoner, he said, and your fate hangs on the justice demanded by the realm. But know this, the knights of the Vale and the North remember. Your gold will not save you here. Tywin did not flinch, though the shackles around his wrists rattled. Then I suppose we shall see what your brand of justice looks like. What came next would shape the future. Some lords argued for Tywin's immediate execution. Others, especially Catelyn, insisted he might be worth more alive. Could they not ransom him for Sansa's safe return, for lasting concessions from King's Landing? Still others, like Roose Bolton, kept their own counsel, eyes calculating. The aura of victory was tempered by the sobering realization that the war was not over. A captive Tywin did not automatically mean King's Landing would fall, nor did it banish the myriad threats arrayed against the North and Vale. For the moment, however, the realm reeled at the news. The unstoppable Tywin Lannister was stopped. The Lannister armies had bled on Riverrun soil and retreated or succumbed. King Joffrey sat in the Red Keep, enthroned on swords that no longer seemed so unbreakable. Whichever way it turned next, whether Robb pressed on to King's Landing, negotiated a peace that recognized northern independence, or bartered Tywin's life for the release of Stark family members, everyone now understood that a new dawn had broken over the 7 kingdoms. In the weeks that followed, Harrenhal teemed with envoys and letters. Lords who once bent the knee to the Lannisters hesitated, wondering if they should switch allegiance. The news breathed hope into the battered Riverlands, and the small folk whispered blessings on the Knights of the Vale, praising them for riding out to protect those once abandoned to the dogs of war. In the north, celebrations were muted by the knowledge that winter was creeping closer, and that Balon Greyjoy's rebellion threatened their coastlines. Still, a sense of grim pride suffused the halls of Winterfell and beyond. Their young wolf, together with the Vale's finest, had done what even Robert Baratheon had not, put Tywin Lannister in chains. So it was that the king in the north found himself in the seat of Harren the Black, a dire wolf at his feet, and a captive lion before him. The great hall's ancient walls echoed with new possibilities, old ghosts silenced by the clamor of steel and the stirring of fresh banners. And in that moment, one truth blazed as clearly as the torches lining the hall. If Robb Stark had been formidable alone, he was nigh unstoppable now with the full support of the Knights of the Vale. Their combined power had broken the might of House Lannister in the Riverlands. The lion, once triumphant, was fallen. The wolf and the falcon stood victorious, poised to reshape the fate of a war-torn land. By every reckoning, the realm would never be the same. King's Landing trembled. The Westerlands cowered. The North and the Vale rose, banners snapping in the autumn wind, forging a brotherhood of arms in the crucible of conflict. And as the chill of winter breathed down from the far north, all the 7 kingdoms now looked upon a new coalition of lords, young, determined, and unyielding in their resolve, who held the power to decide the future of the Iron Throne itself. For Robb Stark, crowned by northern lords and hailed by knights of the Vale, had proven beyond question that the direwolf, once roused, was not to be trifled with, and that together with the soaring falcon, they could bring the Lannisters to their knees.